Good morning, everybody. Hope all of you are doing well. It is great to see so many of you joined to talk about how we can allocate philanthropic resources equitably. I'm really looking forward to our conversation with Karla Nicholson, ED of Haymarket People's Fund, and Damian Wilmot, Senior Vice President and Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Vertex Pharmaceuticals, and a founding member of the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund. Both who have had models that are intentionally designed to advance equity in the grant-making process. I'm looking forward to learning from them both. Before we jump into today's conversation, I just want to go quickly over some Zoom meeting reminders. So closed caption is available for this meeting. All you have to do is just click at the bottom button. There's a closed caption button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Also, the chat function is a great way to engage with other members of the audience, and you can write out questions throughout the session that our speakers will be able to answer throughout the Q&A. A reminder that this meeting is being recorded, so please make sure that you keep yourself muted throughout the speaking portion of the event. Just to go quickly through our agenda, we will start with, after our conversation with Karla and Damian, we're going to be breaking out into, we're going to be going to breakout rooms, which will be followed by a Q&A and the closing of the session. For those of you that are new to SIF, I wanted to give a quick overview so you understand why the work of Haymarket People's Fund and the new Commonwealth Fund are doing so important to us. The mission of SIF is to create positive social change in Greater Boston. We engage leaders, strengthen organizations, and build networks. We know that change can't happen unless all of us participate, and SIF provides a platform to engage. Now, most of you have seen this slide. On the purple side of our model, we are working with nonprofit leaders and organizations in our Social Innovation Accelerator, capacity camps, and ongoing alumni program for over 100 organizations in our portfolio. This work is deep and it's intentional, and we stay with our portfolio organizations for as long as they need us. The organizations we are working with are small to medium-sized nonprofits. Most are grassroots and led by folks who come from the community they serve. Many are not connected yet to philanthropic community, and that is where the green side of our model comes in. On the green side of the model, you will see our funding community, volunteers, and in-kind partners. We know that positive social change can't happen unless all of us participate. SIF provides a platform for folks on the green side and those on the purple side to connect, build relationships, and work together on a strong, vibrant nonprofit sector where resources are allocated equitably and directed to where the need is great. Our intention is to offer programming to our funder community that will help funders grow in their practice and understanding of equitable grant making and direct their resources to grassroots community-led nonprofits. Our nonprofit leaders are working every day to strengthen the sector, and we think our funding community should be doing the same. We need to be here learning from one another because resources are not allocated equitably. Here's what we know. Those in the philanthropic sector that are in charge of making funding decisions do not come from diverse backgrounds. Next slide. Only 8 to 9% of grant making from foundations goes into communities of color. 1% of philanthropic dollars have been allocated to Latinx issues. White-led nonprofit organizations have budgets that were 24% larger than those led by people of color. Nonprofit organizations led by Black women receive less money than those led by Black men or white women. This is why this event and the conversation we're having today is important. This event is part of a broader funder education programming at SIF that aims to increase funder knowledge of social justice philanthropy and equitable funding relationships. Is to encourage funders to invest in more grassroots, community-led nonprofits. I'm really excited about today's conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and turn this over to my colleague, Caroline Shaughnessy, Director of Network Engagement at SIF.
Great, thank you, Pavel, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's great to see such a terrific crowd this morning. I'm really excited to jump into our conversation, and I am lucky enough to be introducing Karla Nicholson and Damian Wilmot. And I'm going to let you know that I shortened their bios. Actually, they're such strong community contributors that it would have taken all of our time together to just share the amazing work they've already done for our community. So Karla Nicholson is the executive director of the Haymarket People's Fund. She's also currently serving as a national board member of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and a member of the Black Directors Network, the Social Justice Funders Network, the New Hampshire Funders Forum, Black and Indigenous Resistance Fund, New England Anti-Racism Organizers, and the Advisory Committee of We Will All Rise. Haymarket is a 47-year-old anti-racist and multicultural foundation that is committed to strengthening the movement for social justice in New England. Through grant making, fundraising, and capacity building, Haymarket supports grassroots organizations that address the root causes of injustice. Damian Wilmot is the Senior Vice President, Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Vertex Pharmaceuticals, and one of the founding members of the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund, which is the hat he is wearing here today. He has served on the boards and advisory committees of numerous nonprofit, civic, and for-profit organizations, including the Massachusetts Judicial Nominating Commission by gubernatorial appointment, the JFK Library Foundation, and the Boys and Girls Club of Boston. In 2010, the Boston Business Journal recognized him as one of Boston's outstanding business leaders under the age of 40. He's also been honored as one of Boston's most influential people of color in healthcare and life sciences. The new Commonwealth Fund for Racial Equity and Social Justice is a coalition of Black and Brown executives in Massachusetts who have come together to leverage their individual and collective power to work with community organizations and coalitions to address and eliminate systemic racism and racial inequity in our Commonwealth. I've had the pleasure of meeting with Karla and Damian a few times over the last couple of months as we were chatting about the session, and I'm really honored to share their work with all of you. So Haymarket's really led the way and been doing this work for almost 50 years. They have very intentionally evolved over time. The new Commonwealth Fund was created in 2020 in response to George Floyd's murder in combination with COVID-19's impact on Black and Brown communities. We'll hear from both leaders today whose work originated in very different ways, and they operate very differently, but they're working towards a common goal. So Karla and Damian, thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Carolyn. Happy to be here.
Great to have you. Let's see, I'm gonna start maybe with an easy question. And maybe Karla, you'll go first and share with us sort of how you came to this work and your commitment to this work.
Absolutely. Good morning, and it's so good to be here with all of you. I have to say that it's interesting. In my career journey, this is my third career, and I didn't come to it by chance. I came to it truly by necessity, because as you learn more and more about the world and how the world operates, and then you begin to bring children into the world and start a family, there's an essential responsibility to really support them and provide them with every opportunity. And when I came to Boston in the 80s and started having a family in the 90s, I realized that in the Fenway community, there was no school, there was no community center, there was nothing that really offered the opportunity for children to thrive. No after-school program. It was seen as a transient type of community where a lot of business people and people in college came, and then things turned over. Well, families came together in that community, and it's just phenomenal what happened. The community is an intergenerational community and multi-generational. And so my organizing really began at that point, I would say. You know, what I did before, I didn't call organizing, but sometimes you have to do what is necessary. And then learning how our world and our society operates, some really intense things come to bear and surface. And in learning, I kept thriving to learn more. And so I learned that at the root of a lot of oppression, not all, but a lot of it was really steeped in racism, and learning how to begin to eradicate that became my journey. And that eventually, after different iterations, being in different spaces, led me to Haymarket People's Fund as a volunteer for a number of years on the board of directors, and eventually onto the staff. And it is a space where I feel like change can be made, but not alone. And I'll stop there for this moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Karla. Damian?
Sure. I think my spirit has always been aligned with to whom much is given, much is demanded. And so I think I've always been someone who's been active in the communities I've been a part of. It's important to me to give back to those communities that we've received something from. And if we have a chance to even enhance those communities, that's even better. And so, NCF, or the new Commonwealth Fund, came about, as you said, Carolyn, really during the height of the pandemic, in literally days after the murder of George Floyd. And so, I know watching that video, the gruesome video of George Floyd's murder, struck many chords for all of us. And I think for me personally, those 9 minutes and 29 seconds just struck a really deep personal chord. Here's this Black man, 46 years old, 6'4", dragged from his car, murdered in the street like an animal. I'm 46 years old. Black man, I'm 6'3", but I am also a father, a husband. All the things that George Floyd was as well. And my kids pointed that out to me, which made a different conversation in our household around this particular issue. Normally, it had been about keeping them safe. This was one where they were concerned about, my safety. And frankly, I just wanted to do something. And so I think me and the other 18 of us, this sort of group, recognize that we are uniquely situated, given our roles at our companies, at our particular companies, our access to capital and resources, our ability to influence and have an impact, particularly as a collective. We wanted to do something. And when we came together, we landed on a very ambitious mission, and that was to dismantle systemic racism, for Black and Latinx communities, Black and Brown communities in the Commonwealth, in 4 pillars in particular. And that was, we sort of narrowed in on policing, criminal justice reform, which is really what brought us together, healthcare equity, economic empowerment, and then youth education and civic engagement. And so we're focused on those 4 pillars, and our approach to achieving that ambitious mission is really threefold. And we can dig into it later, but really it's making trust-based impact grants, particularly to Black and Brown-led organizations serving Black and Brown communities. For all the reasons that Pavel pointed out in his introduction, when you look at where the philanthropic dollars are going and not going, that's where we have that particular focus. We're not going to do that exclusively, but that is certainly a particular focus of our impact grants. Capacity building, really doing more than just giving dollars to those organizations, but sharing with them our access, our influence, our power, connecting them to other grantees, et cetera. And then last, establishing an ecosystem of engagement and action. And I think those are our 3 sort of threefold approach to achieving that mission. That ecosystem, I think, is key. This systemic racism, is 400 years in the making. It's going to take many years and many hands to dismantle that. So we have to get the different stakeholders to the table. We think we can do that. And we set a fundraising goal of $100 million in multi-year commitments to raise that $100 million by the end of this year. And we've done a really nice job so far. We're over $30 million dollars to date. And so we're using that to support these nonprofits, but also to support building this ecosystem and programming that's necessary to do that. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Damian. That's great, and it's interesting to hear how. I guess I'm struck by sort of how both of you talked about having kids being a pivotal point in your sort of activism, both to protect them and to learn from them. So that was particularly interesting. So Damian, I think you started to answer my second question. You might want to add a little bit more when I ask it, but I'll let you kind of continue. But you both have really unique funding models. And you've designed those models specifically to advance equity in the grant making process and to dismantle systemic racism. Can you talk about a little bit more about those funding models and how they're structurally set up differently than traditional grant making to achieve your goals? So Damian, I think you started, if you want to continue a little bit, and then we'll go to Karla and hear a little bit about Haymarket, who's had a long journey.
Yeah, I'd say maybe the three characteristics of our grant making model that might be a little bit different. I mentioned the focus on Black and Brown communities. I think the data point I just saw in the slide said 8 to 9% of the philanthropic dollars are going to Black and Brown communities in the U.S. In Boston, it's actually 2 cents out of every philanthropic dollar supports Black and Brown communities. So even less in Boston. And so we're focused on that community. Those communities are particularly important for us. Black and Brown led organizations, I think you saw those numbers too. The revenues of Black led nonprofits are 24% smaller than the revenues of white led nonprofits. And unrestricted net assets of Black led nonprofits are 96% smaller than white led nonprofits. So, when you just look at the data of where our philanthropic dollars are going, it even highlights the systemic racism even exists in our philanthropy, in our giving in America. And so that was a particular interest in a need that we saw that we could uniquely address. And the last is sort of a trust-based philanthropy approach, and that is unrestricted. There's different components of that, but I think the primary one is unrestricted funding. Trust these organizations to determine where the funds are most needed. And I think that we were not seeing that happen in these Black and Brown communities, sort of unrestricted funding. A particular focus we have as well is just a simplified, streamlined grant process, making it easier to get access to those funds. We're probably a bit more proactive in our approach of identifying the grantees. Either traditional model is the grantees find the funds and they apply for them. And we're literally knocking on doors. It's a data-driven approach, but we're identifying some of these nonprofits are doing the work, in particular in our pillars, in the communities that need the most help, and engaging in them in a conversation around what their needs are and what their focus is. There's a multi-year potential to our grants because we do think that the ongoing support is necessary. And I say the last piece of that that we're still trying. I know you're going to ask a question about this later, but that's the measurement. How do you measure impact? Around these issues, and we're intentionally trying to come up with different approaches to how we measure that. But those are kind of I'd say the highlights of I think what makes our grant making a little bit different.
That's helpful. Thanks, Damian. I want to highlight, that this attention to unrestricted assets, and one of the data points on that slide was that unrestricted assets to nonprofits with leaders of color are actually 76% smaller than those organizations led by by white folks. So I just want to point that out as such an important piece of this conversation. Karla, I'm going to ask you the same question. Can we talk about the sort of structure of Haymarket? Give us a little overview of Haymarket and the structure and how sort of your different approach addresses some of these same issues.
Absolutely. And I echo what Damian said about the level of responsibility we have in this field and really understanding how this field was created. It wasn't created for what our two funds are doing, and a lot of the funds that are on this call today. We're really trying to create change, and we're going against society and how it operates in doing that because it was not structured. The statistics really emphasize that. So what I'll say about Haymarket is almost half a century ago, we were created And a lot of the ways and the structure, the infrastructure in terms of how we operate still resonates and still continues today. And so Haymarket is that funder and has been that funder that provides grassroots groups all across all 6 New England states with the very first funding they receive. Somebody's got to do that. Someone's got to give those groups on the ground the first chance to obtain resources and begin to do the work that only they can do because they're experts in what they do. You know, our job is to bring about the resources and to leverage it and to get it to them to do what they do. And letting the people that are doing the work, the organizing work in the communities, be the ones who also are the determinants for who gets funding, which is very unique. And instead of being top down, you know, oftentimes you have trustees or people within a foundation who are not as close to the community. Some of them are in the community and they're doing wonderful things for the community. But these folks are actually in the trenches every day doing the work, giving them that opportunity to decide where the resources go. And not just in a tokenistic way, but in a genuine manner. And we have a very, very amazing, I mean, we have other questions that pertain to that, but an amazing model for how we do that. Another thing that we found is that we were very focused on social justice for the first couple decades of Haymarket. Then we became more specifically focused on eradicating racism, because that's often the oppression that does not get the attention. And there are many oppressions that are all important, and they're all intersectional in terms of how they operate. But we have to make sure that we get to the root of why that racism exists and the history behind it in order to create change. So all of that to say, we don't have a limit or specific interest areas. We let folks apply for whatever it is that they do in their community and for their community. We just stipulate that it be community organizing, like they're trying to make sure that their community changes, that it is better, and that it's done through that same anti-racist lens. And even our grant application specifies that. We look at those tenets, like your leadership development genuinely from within, you know, looking at how you're accountable to your community. How are you really organizing towards systemic change? And what is your plan? Not just to say that you do it to jump through a hoop that a funder says to be funded, but you're really doing that work. Another thing is, much like, you know, the Commonwealth Fund, we've always said that as long as groups are within what we define as a grassroots realm, they can come back year after year to apply. Because unfortunately, funders will look at a particular issue that is really being highlighted at that time, and then that issue area may change, or they may say, oh, you've been funded for several years, we're gonna take a break. Well, guess what? The intense situation that these people are dealing with around their survival does not take a break. So we have to be there for them. So we've realized through a lot of our capturing of data that there's some groups that we've funded for a decade before they've been able to go out and really stand strong on their own, receive other resources, diversify their resource, and look at ways to really make an inroad. And I'll also say that there is no process that is perfect. We're always looking at the process, reflecting on the process, sort of making changes within it, making sure that we're reflective of the values and the principles that we espouse. So that's really, really significant. And likewise, talking to other funders and not feeling like we've, in a prescriptive way, figured something out, because we haven't. We wouldn't be here today if we had figured this out. So it's really important for us to work together with one another, talk to one another, learn from one another, and be in spaces where that can happen. And what I'll also say is that what's unique about Haymarket is that while we do have an endowment, and I have to be honest, anything that is significant is not small, but it is small in comparison to a lot of other funders' endowments. Yet, the money that we raise our money from individuals. We don't raise money from the government. We don't raise money, you know, from other types of sources. We have always, for almost 50 years, raised it from the people who want to see change. We move those resources. So if we raise $1 million, we move $1 million to community. If we raise a portion of that, we whatever that is, we move that to community. which is very, very vital that happen, so that the community, those experts in what they do, can determine how they use it for operating, for keeping the lights on, for sometimes, how about hiring an organizer, like someone who can really figure out how to move their strategy forward. But it's wonderful to see how the principles and the practices that New Commonwealth Fund and Haymarket uplift are being seen in other funders and other funds as well, because that's what's essential. If we're going to make a change, it's not going to happen one organization at a time. It's got to be a situation where we're all moving forward in a similar manner toward a similar goal and vision.
I think that's such a good point, Karla, that we're not in this work alone. We can't do this work alone. The other thing that strikes me is that you talk about this being a journey, even for Haymarket, who's moved so far in close to 50 years, that you're still learning. And so I think about sort of our guests here today, all coming to this work at different places and thinking this is really about taking the next step, taking the first step for some, and sort of moving towards this journey of, being anti-racist in their giving in a more equitable way. But Karla, you talked about sort of others involved, and Damian, you have as well. And I think we know this work is impossible to do alone. So let's talk for a second about how collaboration fits in. And Karla, when we chatted, you talked about your focus on grantee and even applicant collaboration, which was sort of just something that struck me about SIF's work, particularly our applicants during the process. And you had me thinking about how SIF could probably do more here, and others might feel the same. And then Damian, you talk about this ecosystem of stakeholders that's really aligned with the SIF model, though I think you're doing it differently. So I think let's jump in on collaboration. I'll let you two decide who wants to go first.
I'll defer to Karla.
Damian, you said you were not going to have me go first, but I'll take it. I'll go first. Thank you. When I think about collaboration, I think about the fact that what we do is relational. And so collaboration is like this big, long word. But when you think about what it takes to do it, it's something that we should be doing organically and naturally. It's just connecting with one another. So I'll give a couple of examples of how we do that with our grantees. One of them is our grant process. As I mentioned, the questions that groups are asked to respond to when they apply to us for funding really uplift the same set of anti-racist principles that we espouse. We're trying to make sure that there's that direct connection. We're not just saying it, but we're actually living it. So one of the questions we ask grantees when they apply is about who they're collaborating with, because it tells an amazing story. So after they do the grant making process, and I won't go through all the steps of how we do our process, but when it comes to the point of groups coming together to interview, we do something that I think is vital. We make sure that we're not scrutinizing one group at a time. We are bringing at least 4 groups together for each and every interview all across the region over 2 months' time. And that is significant. So what happens is these groups have had a chance to clarify any questions about the proposal they submitted. So when they come into that room, they're bringing their constituents, the people who are part of the everyday work, not necessarily the ED, not necessarily the grant writer. We want to hear from the people that are most impacted to share what it is in terms of their vision, what it is in terms of what they're doing and they're working on. It's not supposed to be polished or perfect, but it's supposed to really show in a way that you can't put on paper in a proposal. And so I love the fact that the staff is only in a supportive role. We do not interject. We let these organizers and activists who are part of our regional funding panel conduct the process. We're only there for support. I don't want to miss an interview if I can. I go to as many as I can just to sit and hear and get inspired. This is why we do the work. So that collaborative effort among those groups is so phenomenal that after they share, because each group gets to share, we then give them time to ask questions of one another, because sometimes they're focused on the same interest area, or they're just in the same geographic area. Often they haven't had a chance to even meet one another because their work is so intense and so vital to their community that we want them to connect. Out of this, we've seen groups do things like plant a community garden together, share information, go to community meetings in support of one another, go to the State House and rally to lobby and move, tremendous policy. We've seen outcomes over nearly half a century from collaboration. And then very briefly, I'll mention that our grantees come to us. We try to see ourselves as partners to the extent we can. We realize there is a power dynamic. There's no question about that. But to them, to feel that they can come to us and talk to us and be honest with us. Out of that, they've said, look, we want to connect with one another beyond just the interview. We want to connect across the region. And so we have Haymarket in collaboration with other funders, like Episcopal City Missions Burgess Urban Fund, like Heinz Foundation, Resist. We've worked with other funders to form a grantee gathering where grantees can be a part of the planning process for what they need. So it might be around networking, it might be around community building, base building, it might be around movement building, but whatever it is they need, they're at the table planning and having a voice on what that's going to be. And that has emerged now over 10 years. And even during this time, this international health crisis that we're in, we're still doing this virtually because they want to connect with one another. And that's the epitome of collaboration in Haymarket's mind.
That's amazing, Karla. And I think about sort of how Vule talks about the nonprofit Hunger Games and the competition for funding, and this sort of takes the air out of that competition and really raises up collaboration in a way that I think is really powerful. Damian, can I turn this question to you?
Yes, I think for us, when we started off with NCF, it was always important for us for it to be a big tent, that would be a highly collaborative sort of model, particularly around building the ecosystem. And so right now, the phase that we're in is really a lot of listening and learning, to be honest with you. And so, it was always important for us, for our work to be data driven, but we also didn't want to dictate to many of these communities, here's what you need, right? Because that was frankly one of the things we were hearing quite a bit when we were getting out and speaking to a lot of these groups, is that they're often told, here's what we're going to give you, here's what you need, here's where you need to spend the funds. And so we're doing a lot more listening and learning from those groups. I think what's also just been great is how much this model has been embraced by a number of different stakeholders. So we've spent a lot of time with a number of government leaders. The city of Boston early on had been a big supporter of what we were doing, and a lot of collaboration there. The Attorney General's office, Governor Baker's office, TBF. We're a donor advised fund right now of the Boston Foundation. They've been a great resource and collaborator with us on our programs, our way of thinking, et cetera. And not just TBF, frankly, many of the foundations that are represented here today, by the way, reached out to us and engaged us in a lot of conversations. We've been listening and talking to a lot of the corporate foundations. My company has a foundation, as do many of the founding members' companies. And so a little bit of a listening tour. Also corporations that don't have a founding member in the 19, but listening to them. One of the pros of Zoom is being able to do this nationally as well. We've been able to connect with leaders around the country who are focused on these issues. Charlene Eiffel, who leads the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, spent a good amount of time with us and helping, at least identifying for us the issues that she was seeing, or her the Legal Defense Fund was seeing on a national level in terms of issues that we should be thinking about here in the Commonwealth, and so many other groups. And so highly collaborative, has been our approach. Managing this is a challenge, because we're doing a lot of listening and having a lot of meetings, but it's been really helpful for many of us because, we're experts in our day job. There's a lot of things I would say I might be an expert in. I have an interest in all the different pillar issues, but I'm not necessarily an expert in them. So it's really important for us to get the data and the research and hearing from the folks who are closest to these issues, what the issues are. And then the last point on collaboration, when we announced what we were doing with NCF here in Boston, it got picked up on some national sort of media feeds. And so we start to hear from leaders in other cities sort of reaching out and say, listen, we'd love to do something like that, do something similar to NCF in our city. So we've been having a lot of those conversations with leaders in other major cities around the country. And so since the launch of NCF, there's been, I think, by our last count, about 9 similar organizations that popped up in different parts of the country. And so staying connected to them has been important as well, so that we're all thinking about, the issues, or talking about the issues, sharing data, and even talking about how are we going to measure impact going forward. So a lot of those things are happening real time, but it's just been it's been great to sort of approach it in that way. So that's all I'd say about that. It's been a huge effort, but it's been very educational.
That's great. Thanks, Damian. I'm struck by sort of the 19 folks that are engaged have really sort of, you've sort of harnessed the reach of that leadership just as your foundation, right? So you were collaborating from the get-go in a really unique way, I think. I'm going to shift to talking about measuring impact, because I think this is a place where many nonprofits feel they aren't aligned with funders. And I can say that when we sort of talk to our alumni council of nonprofit leaders, this is something they want to talk to funders about, that they just feel like you're not on the same page. So how are you considering that alignment in your relationship with grantees? And again, I'll let either of you jump in.
Karla, you're going to be able to give a lot more substance to this one than I.
But feel free if you want to go first. I'll give you a go first that you gave me. Why don't you go first?
I'll be quick. I think, as I've been hinting at, we're sort of still sorting that piece out. I think we're hearing exactly what you said, Carolyn, from a lot of these groups, is that there's a lot of restrictions and process put around how these nonprofits can use the funds, and what would be the gateway decision to get more funding is by, all right, we want to see these numbers, and there is a strong disconnect. What we're trying to do is line up with our measurement, around how do we measure impact, but looking at different metrics. You have to measure it, of course. I think I don't see how you can show that you're having impact without doing some measurement. But I think we have to get beyond our current approach. I mean, there's some easy things that one could look at. There's groups, for example, doing vaccination outreach, for example. You could measure impact by number of people signing up to get vaccinated. That's one way to measure that. But when really the real effort is getting out and educating many of the folks in the community as to why getting a vaccine is safe, why it makes sense to try to build up the immunity of the community. How do you measure that, right? How do you show that the message is resonating and people are buying into it? So I don't have an answer to that, but I think the point is you have to look at it differently. And when we're talking about getting rid of systemic racism, there's some measurements we can look at. We could look at, are we seeing more, people of color in Fortune 500, C-suite positions? That's one measurement. But, there are so many other things that we could be looking at to make sure that even that space feels different for the folks who are involved in that process. So we're looking at all those things, Carolyn. I can't tell you that we've figured it all out necessarily, but we are certainly in the position of we're whiteboarding this, throwing out old ways of measuring it, and coming to it, I think, with just an open mind as to how we might want to work with these nonprofits and building their capacity, their impact in a very different way.
Yeah, I think it's exciting that you're in a place where you can create something new.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a learning journey. So Karla.
Absolutely. A learning journey it is. You know, we can gather information. It's what we do with it. You know, and like Damian, what you said, to what end? Like, we're trying to fulfill our mission. We have something very, really big and tremendous that we're trying to use this data for. We're not just collecting it to be collecting it. We realized at Haymarket that there were a lot of ways we were collecting data that we could synthesize. Like every group that receives funding from us does a report. Now, the report is nowhere near as extensive as, and I won't mention any names, but a lot of you know there are some funders who have very, very extensive demographics. You have to jump through a lot of hoops to like fill out their funding report every year. It's not anywhere near that intense in terms of what we're looking for, but we are asking for very essential information. And then we each year do an analysis that we present to the Haymarket board and community, saying, this is what has happened this year. Because we're regional, we want to see state by state. We want to see what the leadership looks like. We want to see, like, if we're not supporting some groups, some states as much. Like, what we found is all of a sudden our funding dipped in New Hampshire. Why? What do we need to figure out about New Hampshire that's different, where that wasn't a problem before? How do we look at that landscape? So it's to an end. You know, is the point that I'm making. The other thing that we did is we're very relational. We have a lot of partners that we work with. Some of those partners are academic partners. We do a lot of work with Boston College and Simmons University. And so we talked to our partners and we said, okay, we need to figure out, being who we are and how we operate, how do we collect information in a good way? I'm also a collaborative fellow for a participatory action research course at Boston College that I've done for probably, I guess, about 6 years or so now. And so let's look at this in a participatory manner, which resonates with how Haymarket operates, you know, where we come up with that research question with community, where we're working with community to make sure that they're gaining something from what we collect. So it's not just research that impacts them and benefits us. And so we're in the midst of a quantitative process right now to look back over 20 years of anti-racist grant making. And I can't wait to be able to share those results with you when we conclude that process. And the last thing I'll say is that participatory grant making has become like this word that you're hearing a lot, a little bit of rhetoric, but you're hearing it a lot, okay? Which is beautiful because it does need to be participatory. Haymarket, we just call it grant making because we've been doing it for so long. So what's happened is some national funders have come to us and wanted us to be a part of processes. So we've been able to bring several things together and say, look, we're already doing this research project. We can share these outcomes so they can more broadly be shared so that we can all learn. But we've got to look at impact and how we measure it in more and more creative ways and never reinvent the wheel. Look at what has been successful in the way that others have done it too.
That was so good. She could go first or second. It doesn't make a difference.
Damian, you're making my day.
I think it's that 47 years of experience that Haymarket has. I think they've used it well. So I think a great follow-on question to talking about measurement is talking about relationships. And, you know, I think as I see lots of conversation in the chat about trust-based philanthropy, and some of what we hear from our grantees is they want to talk about measurement. They want it to be open-ended. They want to tell you about their successes. So when we talk about, you know, equitable relationships, I think about learning from one another. Whether it's measurement or something else, can you talk about what these equitable, sort of more trust-based relationships look like? Maybe give an example in your work. And I'm, again, not going to decide who goes first. I think that's up to the two of you.
Just an example, Carolyn, of.
Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yeah. Yeah. Something you've learned from each other, something that's sort of, you know, what does that look like in your organization? Sort of a more equitable grant making relationship.
Yeah, I would say it's a good question. I think what we've really tried to do is partner with many of these groups to do, again, more than just give them funding. And so we're in a fortunate position, given the companies we work at, our access to, I mean, everything from law firms to accounting firms, you name it. And so connecting those groups to some of those in-kind support that they might need, we've been doing a lot of that. Some groups just want to sort of talk about sort of their approach and even their pitch at times, and how do they sort of strengthen that. And so we've given them, we've been an audience for them for that as well. And so I think right now what it's looked like for us is just a lot of partnership with these groups beyond just giving them the funding. And some of that has been also just making connections to government folks that they haven't heard back from, and that we can lend our voice to. Some things have been, initiatives that they're, engaged in. For example, we supported the NAACP of Boston with a grant back in October or November of last year, sort of like our first grant making that we did. And they later were, they were one of the amicus parties in the Boston Public School lawsuit that was back in, I think, in January, February of this year. And so they came back to talk to us about that, about some support that they might need from us in that effort. And really, that it was pretty broad what we were doing with them. We were hearing some of their legal arguments and agreed to sign on to one of the amicus briefs. And so again, just I think trying to do a little bit more in a partnership with amplifying their voices and supporting them in making a bigger impact.
I think that's such a good point. I do know that sort of funders introducing grantees to other funders and other resources would take a huge burden off organizations. And those are our networks, right? We can do that. And that would be a huge way to lift a burden for folks.
And our corporate foundations as well, we have access to that. And so while we've supported many of these nonprofits through NCF, we've actually then introduced them back to our own corporate foundations to get more support. So, I agree with you 100%, Carolyn. There's a lot that we can do to really elevate and amplify their work.
Yeah, Karla.
Absolutely, I totally agree with what you're saying, Damian, because we can very easily in foundations become siloed. Like we got a great formula, we're figuring this out, we're just like better than ice cream, but we need to connect with others. And the thing is, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There have been iterations of collaborations and equitable relationships that have been built among funders. And to look at that and how that has emerged and what we need now. So the Social Justice Funders Network came about for that same purpose and decided not to just take on actions, but to be a learning network, to really figure out how do we just sit with one another and learn from one another and learn about what's going on in the field and build from there. And that has been phenomenal, not perfect. There are all sorts of things that you learn when you are on that type of a journey. One thing I'll emphasize is that we bring our principles and practices to that space in any fund. I'm not just saying Haymarket, but as Haymarket, what we brought, we've seen that really come together like never before right now. Because of the insurrection, because of the lynchings, because of what we're living in now, we've seen funders who we formed equitable relationships with take things to another level. It has been phenomenal. And there are many examples. One that I'll just emphasize is that Arrington, who's the ED at Burgess Urban Fund of Episcopal City Mission, came to me and came to David Moynihan, and we started having conversations, just talking. We're already friends, figuring out like, how do we move resources? What do we do? How do we work together? And out of that conversation came the fact that we can't just be reactional. We can't just react and be transactional as funders or to a moment. And I know this is one of your questions, Carolyn, but we
Jump in, Karla.
But we have to expand beyond that. We've got to think about how do we get to the level of transformation. And so as we started talking to other funders and people started, like pooling money together, we have formed what we call the Black and Indigenous Resistance Fund. Because again, you look at the statistics and the data and what's happening to the Black community that has been happening forever. What has been happening to the people whose land that we stand and live and just, like suck resources out of, and how do we specifically provide that support? But what I'll just say in terms of equity real quickly is that we had to do it differently. We couldn't be top down. We couldn't say, okay, this is what we're doing. This is what you need to do to get the money. Instead, we looked at grassroots leaders and said, this is an opportunity that we've never experienced. We want you to help develop the fund. We want you to determine what the criteria is. We want you to decide all of this. And we will stay in our lane and we'll leverage the resources for you to do what you need to do. And we're going to do it long term. So that is exciting and it's new. And once again, just like a lot of things that are happening, I look forward to sharing all of that with all of you as it unfolds. So funding hasn't gone out yet, but it will very soon. So another opportunity, that's what it is.
Great. And Karla, we're happy to help share that to this community. So you'll let us know when that happens, when that's ready. So you led us right into sort of our final question before we move into our next section, but we are in a watershed moment, and there is a lot of attention being paid at this moment to the goals you're both working towards. There seems to be a growing realization, particularly by white people, about the impact of systemic racism. So we know that dismantling systems is a long-term effort. So how do we take advantage of this moment and do this work in a deeper, broader, and sustainable manner? And Karla, I think the fund touches on that for sure. Curious about Damian, Karla, other things you're thinking about, just sort of hold on to this momentum and help folks kind of keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, right? I think it's because I think that's probably my greatest fear too, is that we just move on, that we really look at it as a moment and not sort of transform that into a movement and then just, move on to whatever the next moment is. And I think, so that is certainly something that concerns me. In many ways, I think we're all, we cannot wait. I'm in the office today. Folks cannot wait to get back to a sense of normalcy, right? And get through COVID and put 20 behind us. But I think, the way we help to sustain, I think, this effort and make it into movement are things like this. We have to have these conversations, the dialogue. We have to keep shining a light on it. I think something that's really struck me in this last year doing this work is the number of communities that are suffering real time right now in the Commonwealth. We're talking to these groups, particularly outside of Boston. You get to some of these communities that are not getting the funding. We already talked about the numbers in terms of how few dollars get to Black and brown communities. It's even less outside of Boston. And so you have these communities that have really been ravaged by COVID-19 and the impact on the health of that community, the impact on their, the economy of that community and their ability to be housed, to be fed, et cetera. It is pretty traumatic. And so, so folks are suffering. We have to keep shining a light on those issues and keep bringing the attention and the resources to it to sustain it. But I think it's really on us to do that. And this is where the whole ecosystem concept comes from, is that we have to pull in the leaders from our different sectors to be a part of that conversation, to be focused on it. Because if we don't do that effectively, I do fear that it'll pitter out a little bit or a lot.
Yeah, I just noted moment to movement. I think that's pretty powerful. Karla?
And I feel like I really spoke to that. And I can't emphasize enough that, while we're in a watershed moment, we've got to look at it more expansively. We got to realize, like Damian said, 400 years. Oh my gosh, that's like generations and generations of what we now have the responsibility to contend with, that we don't want to pass on as a legacy to the next generation. You know, it's just something that we have to deal with. It's at the center of everything. I talk about it being part of the air we breathe and the water we drink. Like racism, if we do nothing, just say like all of our wonderful funds just stopped and did nothing, this would still perpetuate itself again and again and again, over and over through time. And so this is really intense and really serious. So I encourage everybody to learn more about how systemic racism operates, and you know, how we can really get at the root of making a difference, and understanding philanthropy, the history of it, and how we are gatekeepers, and we can swing that gate open widely and provide so much opportunity. This is like so significant and so wonderful. And I'll just say lastly that it's not about transaction, it's really about moving toward transformation.
Thanks, Karla. That's I appreciate the sort of visual of swinging that gate open widely, because we can do that. And so I'm going to pause here. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we've gotten some great questions in the chat, but I'm not going to get right to the chat because we're going to send folks to breakout rooms, and I'm going to encourage people to stay. I know breakout rooms are kind of the great escape for the Zoom meeting, but I'm going to encourage you to stay by telling you that we're going to have Q&A with Damian and Karla after the breakout rooms. I think it will help to take a minute to sort of reflect on what we've heard today and think about sort of what are the barriers to change, what's getting in the way of folks sort of making these changes in your organization. So we'll send you into breakout rooms to have a chat. Maybe I'm gonna make it 8 or 10 minutes to think about some of the barriers you or your organization, as you consider incorporating a more equitable approach to grant making, what's getting in the way. And then with that in mind, feel free to bring back any questions you have from there for Karla and Damian. I know we won't get to all the questions, but we'd love to see your questions. And we will come back and have a good bit of time to chat with Karla and Damian about sort of some questions you came up with in your breakout rooms. So we're going to send folks off. Welcome back, everyone. Hi, Amy. So nice to see you.
That's never long enough. It's my only.
It's never long enough, and I apologize. I know it's not.
It's a good, it's just such a great thing to be able to have those conversations.
I know, but you know, I know, but nobody wants to stay for 2 hours with us. I wish you all would. Okay, I'm going to jump into, folks are welcome to put any of the questions they came up with in the chat, because I think it'd be great for folks to see them. But I'm going to jump into some questions that we already got for Karla and Damian. And I'm going to start just, I think, Karla, some folks were interested in some clarity around how your participatory model works. How are folks making decisions, and how are you selecting those folks who are your decision makers?
Wonderful. Well, I'll start with how we select folks. So having had such, a long history in the region, it's relational. People who know people recommend people. We reach out to a lot of our grants. Some of our grantees, I must emphasize, are decision makers. We have very strict conflict of interest, indirect and direct policies, but that's how we find people. And then, like all of you, we reach out to people we know, and we said, look, we're looking for people to be a part of this group, because with the number of proposals we receive, it is essential that we have enough people so that the process can go smoothly. And I'll just mention a couple of things about the process. So we're very accountable. Once again, we emphasize and uplift those principles we stand for. So the staff does an initial screening of the proposals of the people who are interested in applying to make sure that they meet the criteria, because we actually want them as the first entry for funding to be able to have a good process and to potentially get funded. After we receive the proposals, we also do an internal process to make sure that even though they said they met the criteria, that they actually do, before we move those proposals onto the funding group. And any groups, whatever we say doesn't matter, because if they want to pull those groups in and say, oh no, this is important work, we need to review this, they can. but we do everything in teams. So that's one thing I'll emphasize in terms of like accountability. So the same packet of proposals that one member reads, that's a new member, a veteran member, in terms of mentoring, reads it as well. And then we go through a process where they review those and they come together, and the determination is who are they not funding? So then they can go really deeply into the groups that they're potentially going to fund. And the groups that they're not going to fund receive a great deal of feedback. The other thing is that I'll emphasize is throughout our process, decisions are made by consensus, which is mind blowing. I came to that when I came to Haymarket and had never experienced anything like it. So it makes it very thorough, very inclusive. It just like emphasizes all these principles and things, but we do like a first round. Then we do the 2 months that I mentioned to you of interviews. Then everyone comes back together for the final decisions. And that process is a weekend-long retreat. And it is like something to experience. Sometimes we have a funder come in and just like observe the process so that they can see what it is that we do. But what I'll emphasize lastly is that no matter how the process goes, in the end, we spend time on reflections. You need to look back. That analysis I was talking about, what areas are we funding? Are we treating groups that are led by women or people that identify in a different manner, the same way that we're, like really assess all those things to make sure that we're being fair and not just that we're tired because it's been a weekend, to move those decisions forward and to determine what things do we need to do between cycles to make the next cycle better. And so I'll leave it at that for now, but it's a very intensive, it's not a short process, but it's a very thorough process. And we try to keep improving on it. And we're, like I said, we're always looking for people in the region, always, because they bring amazing voices and perspectives.
Again, I think that continuous learning is the key, right? You're always evaluating your own process and improving on it. And yeah, that's one of SIF's core values. And we think about that all the time. So appreciate you saying that. So Damian, I'm going to ask you this question. We had a question, whether you think there will be a collision of cultures between trust-based philanthropy and the specific gateways that corporate executives are accustomed to building into project progress assessment.
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't think there'll be necessarily a collision of culture around the concept of trust-based philanthropy, because I do think many of our organizations do that already, right? They're just not doing it with Black and Brown led organizations serving Black and Brown communities, but in many ways, they're already giving unrestricted funds to many organizations, not dictating where those funds go, et cetera. So I don't think necessarily a collision of culture. I think where there might be some conflict might be in how do you measure impact? How do you assess how it's working, right? And I think that's going to be, those would be interesting discussions to have, because there's certainly a way, it's funny that I think in that question, the assumption is that the measurement piece comes from corporate executives in how we look at programs and how we're assessing impact. I can say that, just spending my time with this group of 19 executives and then the other executives I speak to, the bigger focus has been around, I guess, just impact in general, but certainly an openness in thinking about, or, I think everyone thinks that there needs to be some measurement, but how do we measure it? I found most people seem to be open to doing it in a different way and find that interesting and compelling, as opposed to shunning away from it. And I actually found the more, challenging conversations have been with the nonprofits or foundations themselves, and kind of unlearning that way of showing progress and thinking about doing it a different way. And so, I think a lot of it's going to be maybe not necessarily a collision of cultures, but I think just we're going to need a lot of conversation and dialogue around how do we measure this differently. But with the concept of trust-based philanthropy, I don't necessarily see a collision or a problem there. It really is going to be on the assessment.
I appreciate you shining a light on the fact that trust-based philanthropy is not new. It just isn't happening to Black and Brown-led organizations. Right. So it's such an important point to note. Thank you for saying that. Karla, we have a question for you. Just what makes you hopeful these days?
Oh my goodness. I operate on hope. You know, Damian mentioned like his spirit moving him. My spirit moves me every day. I wake up and I think I get another chance to do this work because it's so vital. You know what I mean? We can make a difference in the world in so many ways, but thank goodness I get to do what I do. And I've never seen anything like in my lifetime, and I'm 59, in like 2 weeks, I'm turning 60, and I am excited because I'm seeing things unfold that I've never experienced. Like people are awakening, people are seeing things that we've been trying to help them to see for a very, very long time. The other thing that gives me hope is my family. Family is everything. It's why I do what I do. You know what I mean? I don't want to pass this on, as I said earlier, but I want to like work toward creating a change. And now I have young adults and they're seeing the light too. So that all of that gives me hope. And then I'll leave you with the fact that the co-founder of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, Ron Chisholm, said racism was done and it can be undone.
That's fantastic.
Great answer, Karla. Damian, do you want to answer that? I actually love that question.
What gives me hope?
Yeah.
I think, you know, there's some things that concern me, I guess. I am a lawyer, so I tend to focus on the negative often. But I'd say the hopeful piece of a lot of this, the conversations we're having, I think the excitement and interest in these initiatives, and it's not just NCF. There's so many other things that have popped up, and the work that even SIF is doing. I mean, there seems to be just an energy around being involved in these things, to really roll up their people want to roll up their sleeves, get their hands dirty, and get involved in these issues, and really try to dig in and just do something, do anything. We have these conversations in my own company that we've been having a lot of listening circles with employees, and people are just raising their hands saying, how do I get more involved? I care about this issue, that issue. I want to do something about it. And I just think that energy makes me hopeful that there seems to be a collective response to what we're all seeing and what we're experiencing, and wanting to sort of change that. So I think that's great. Certainly, quote unquote, young people keep me hopeful. I love how active and how diverse these groups have been. That have been, hitting the pavement, and they're on the streets. They're making their voices heard. That gives me hope. And I see that in my own kids. My kids, they're going out. They're marching. They want to be a part of that. So that really gives me hope too. That there seems to be this energy, this collective energy around really making a sustainable, real, impactful change. And so that all of those things give me hope.
Great. Appreciate you sharing that. So I want to ask a question about your organizations, as you are both fundraising organizations as well as grant giving organizations. And so I want to make note of that because we're in a room of funders. And so for folks who want to learn more, I think we're going to put some contact information in the chat, and then we'll send it in a follow-up email as well. But Karla, you talked about specifically funding from individuals. What does that look like? And Damian, what does your fundraising look like? Let's just take a moment on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question, because it's vital. I mean, as I mentioned, the money, the resource that we raise, we move to the community. So we have to raise significantly to support the community in in any type of really significant manner, So our founder, George Pillsbury, being a person of inherited wealth, initially in Haymarket's early years, George and people he knew, his family and all, they contributed. So there was largesse that was moved to community in the first 20 or so years. But I cannot emphasize enough that when we saw the light and we started deepening and focusing on the racial discord that was at the root of oppression and leadership of color that was genuine, not tokenistic, rose, a lot of the funding went away. A lot of it. So that is the leadership that I stepped into. It took me and our development coordinator 5 years to get the same people, and not all these people were people with wealth. These are a lot of various people who give. It took us 5 years to instill the trust that we knew what we were doing and that we were continuing the work. That's not okay. That's not all right. All of that to say that now, next year will be my 15th year at Haymarket. We're in a position now that we have created a sustainability plan to ensure that we increase grants, to ensure we own a building in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. We want to make sure that we're able to be good stewards of that building. We want to make sure that the folks, the grassroots groups who rent from us, can keep office space well below the retail costs of Boston, which is insane. You know, these are the things we're trying to put into place. But why does people of color leadership have to jump through hoops to get to a point to show and to create a situation where we can continue to do what we've been doing for a lot of years? And so that is really significant. One other thing that's happened is during the pandemic, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, through relationships, we have a colleague who was in Western Mass, who now works there, who emphasized that in addition to them supporting the area that they normally support, that they should also support a group in New England called Haymarket People's Fund. We received $1 million to give for direct services during a pandemic because we know the community. We don't give resources for direct services. We don't do that. But we did it because it was a necessity. The other thing that happened is that the Nellie Mae Foundation that supports education, also who's a relational partner, came to us and said, we want to give you resources this year. So we were able to give so significantly, but it's got to continue. So people have to keep supporting the work, believing in the work. And Haymarket is very accessible. I put my email in the chat as well as the fact that the SIF staff has as well. I want to keep talking. I want to keep answering questions. I want you all to understand what we do because we have now become a people's fund. Instead of a pyramid of a lot of people with a lot of resources giving to Haymarket, now we are scrappy. We have a lot of people who give whatever they can give because they know that if they don't support themselves and their community, they're not going to necessarily have anyone who's going to look out for them. So, you know, I really want to keep this conversation going with all of you about how we can work together to help our communities.
Thanks, Karla. Damian, I will let you close us out with that sort of same question.
Well, our funding started with us. You know, the 19 of us first put in $1 million of our own money, and so we that's how we seeded the fund. And then our corporations largely supported our effort. In many ways, it was trust-based philanthropy to us because we just had an idea at the time, and they were committing large amounts of funds to NCF early on. But building on that, that's led to other corporate dollars and a number of other corporate foundations supporting NCF, a number of family donors or individuals. I've been struck by the number of smaller amounts where folks just read about what we're doing and went online and donated, not just within the Commonwealth, but from around the country. So that's been fantastic. But I would say in terms of, you know, much of our time has been largely been focused on bringing in other corporate dollars and corporate leadership foundations and what have you, you know, because obviously we're trying to raise up $100 million. So that's been a big focus. As I mentioned, some of the foundations that were represented in this conversation today have given. So it's been coming from a lot of different places, largely corporate dollars for sure. The city of Boston, actually, even if you recall, the city of Boston had itself started a racial equity fund. They actually transferred those funds over to NCF last year or beginning of this year. So some great sort of interest and support from a lot of different sectors, but that's been largely been focused. But I'd say, sort of similar to Karla, I think this has been great for me just to participate in this. And already I'm learning from Carolyn and Karla and just our limited conversations. I love to just learn more from a lot of the folks like who are here on this call, who are even closer to the issues and are on the ground doing this work. And so, and not just, getting the dollars, just want to hear your thoughts and be part of, I want to just benefit from your thought leadership around these issues, where we should be focused, not just by neighborhoods, but by issues as well. And so thank you for just having me be a part of this. This has been great.
Thank you both. I want to just make note of the fact that through our whole conversation, your models are so different and the way you've approached the work is so different, and you're working just towards the same goal in different ways, and there isn't one right way. So appreciate hearing from both of you so much, and you taking the time today, and appreciate our guests staying with us. So thank you for that. I want to thank the SIF team as well for helping. I did see lots of interest in trust-based philanthropy in the chat. So I want to note that we actually have an event at the end of July with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. So that's coming soon for folks to sort of learn more about that model. So very much appreciate all of you being here, and very much appreciate Damian and Karla, you being here, but also the great work that you and your teams are doing in the community. So I'll close us out, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, I have a survey that's coming. We'll drop it in the chat. Just a quick 3 question. If people could click on it before you sign off, and then we'll also